Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to episode 8 of the Low Down on Low Code. I'm coming to you today from Wanaka, New Zealand. I'm your host, Ryan Duguid, and I'm joined today by my co-host, John Rymer. Rob's not with us today. And also today we have Nick Ford with us from Mendix. Mendix, for those of you who don't know, is a leader in the low-code space. And we're excited to dig in and learn a little bit about Mendix, their journey, Nick's time with them. He has a storied career there that sees him coming from background in software engineering, in a long journey in the low-code space. He's once described himself as a 4GL programmer, for those of you who know what that means. He's been a sales leader. He's been VP of marketing. Really interesting tidbit of information here that Nick and I have shared the title of chief evangelist along the way, so we might jump a little bit into what it means to be an evangelist in this space. And he's now the chief growth officer at Mendix. And so what I thought I'd do is kick it off by handing over to John. John, you go way back with Nick. I believe you met up with him back as far as 2012 in Rotterdam. And so maybe if you could just take us through a bit of that background and your experiences with Mendix over the years.
Thanks, Ryan. And Nick, welcome. It's great to see you again.
Likewise.
Yeah, I was thinking about Mendix, in, preparing for this episode. And Nick, Mendix hired me. I was working at Forrester as an analyst, as a keynote speaker for Mendix World 2012. And at that point, the low-code market was growing and developing, but the term was really nascent, and there, was, I frankly, I expected to show up, maybe there'd be 50 or 100 people there. And I turned up in Rotterdam, and there's 600 people, and there's great customer stories, right up on stage. And as someone who was making a bet and doing research into this area, it's like, oh, I guess this really is real.
It's happening.
It's really happening. And obviously, you guys have never looked back. So it's just a really interesting story. Ryan mentioned, Nick, that your background is quite varied, including building software using fourth generation languages.
Yeah.
Maybe tell us a little bit more about how you got into low code, and kind of what that journey's been like.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, it goes way back to the late 1980s, actually. I started off my career as a junior COBOL programmer, would you believe it, in the steel industry in Sheffield. I remember it vividly, working for a company called the Davy Steel Corporation, sadly no longer with us, as many of the steel manufacturers in the UK have gone now, obviously outsourced abroad. And I was working at the bottom of what's called the Sheffield Moor in an office, tables full of COBOL programmers. I was 19 at the time. And I was working with a wonderful lady called Brenda. She was an analyst programmer and created these specifications, works of art, pseudocode specifications, SSADM. You'll probably remember those things from way back in the day. And I was sitting in the corner, grappling with learning COBOL. But that was one of the things I thought I could get a handle on. I've been involved in sort of developing software personally, at home before that. But what dawned on me at the time is I would build the software to the specification, and functionally it would do what I expected it to do. But the return rate on the software was very high. And I just didn't understand the terms, materials requirements planning, sales order processing, sales invoicing, nominal ledger. We were building a suite of software for manufacturing. I didn't know what those terms meant. And it dawned on me that I remember vividly sitting in that office at the time thinking there's got to be a better way of building software. Neither I or Brenda ever spoke to an end user. Brenda never talked to anybody who was going to use the software. I'd never even met an end user, and I didn't know the subject matter expert. I knew nothing about manufacturing, and I was just getting into the world of COBOL. So I had this moment sitting in this office thing, there's got to be a better way of building software. This can't be the way it's done. Fast track to today through, that took me on a journey through the early fourth generation languages of Ingress and Infomix. A product called Sea Change, which you probably never heard of. That was a UK 4GL authored in a place called York. I spent 7 years working with them there. And then sort of late 90s, early 2000, I joined a company called Magic Software. A Magic Software, I would argue, were the world's first no-code, table-driven environment. We were building applications across client-server, DB200 and AS400, Unix machines, porting them live. Incredible journey. And then I took a bit of a turn right into the dark side and became, a salesperson for a while, just to try and understand really how the world works outside of software. And then always with the intention of coming back in the software industry. And then I bumped into the founders of Mendix about 14 years ago, Derek Rose and Derek Young and Roald Creit. And I've been with that company. When I joined, there were sort of about 35 people in the company about 14 years ago, and the rest is history, really. Here we are today. So it's been a sort of a career-long passion. And at times I've thought, I must be crazy pursuing this, because I can tell you it's been very difficult. I mean, it's great that we are where we are eventually, but I can tell you the road here, as you probably know, John, and maybe yourself, Ryan, it's been a rocky road as we got here. So that's a bit of the potted history in the background to how I made it to low code and experiences.
Magic software, I love it.
Yeah,
talk about a company that was ahead of its time. Wow,
way ahead. I can say it was very difficult selling that technology at that time. I mean, it's hard now, but selling it then. But great technology, way ahead of the time. Wonderful CEO, David Assia at the time at Magic.
So, Nick, you obviously good fortune of turning up at a time when the founders were there. They're engaged. They're passionate. They're getting this thing off the ground. So, what was the vision they pitched you on back in the day, 14 years ago, and how has that changed in the subsequent years?
Well, I can tell you, directly connected to that moment I had back in the late 1980s, when I realized that to develop software, you need to understand the subject matter. You need to know what you're building. You need to understand what the problem is from the end user's perspective. And we've grappled with that right the way through the last 30 years of connecting somebody who understands how to develop software with somebody who understands the problem. And the challenge has always been to bring them together and create a medium through which they can communicate. And software doesn't do that. Certainly 3GL software, nor did 4GL software. And argue that we're still grappling with that challenge today. How do we open up the aperture for multiple different participants? Software development's a team sport, right? It requires multiple different disciplines to come together to get it done properly, cost effectively, efficiently. And the idea was pretty simple. Roald Creit, who's one of the brothers that started Mendix, was a Java programmer. He came out of university building Java, excellent programmer, incredibly intelligent guy, and built incredibly functionally useful software. Well, functional software. It did what customers asked of him. But again, he experienced the same as me. He would go to customers with the software, and he'd walk through how it works, and customers were very rarely impressed. It did what he had been asked to build, but actually, they would come up with all sorts of things. Well, shouldn't it look like this? Couldn't it do that? Wouldn't it be better if we designed it this way? And he had the same sort of moment as I did, which led him to set up Mendix, which was collaboration. The ability to bring together those two different skill sets has to be facilitated by a technology that is open and accessible. And the only way to do that is not to kill code, but to create an environment where those two people can share a common understanding of what's been built and can participate together. So that was what really, really, struck a chord with me, and it went back. It took me right back to the late 80s, and I thought, here's an opportunity with a group of people that really get it and have started to build a product to address that problem. So it was exciting to hear that.
So if you take that approach, it's always interesting to me, because I keep telling people, somewhat biased as a product leader, but the crossover between the discipline of product management and the world of low code in this regard is really significant, right? Because the job of the product manager is to bring those sides together and to create that conduit for that flow of information. What are the problems that we're trying to solve? What are the challenges the users are facing? And how do we work with product design and engineering to get that built? So in the world of low code, there's obviously this spectrum, right, of folks who would say they're no code. Asterisk always, I think we've discussed that, John. And then folks who would say they're low code, and you go, well, it looks like there's a lot of low code. And so if you think about that journey, so on the one hand, I try to take people who understand the business and enable them to build more themselves, right? And on the other hand, I try to facilitate an environment that you've described where I can bring people who understand software and bring them closer to the end users and more collaboratively working with the end users. Yeah. So from a Mendix perspective, where would you say the company and philosophically and the technology sits? And how do you see, because we all sort of, everyone in their minds, I think, has this either a spectrum or quadrants, or, every vendor tries to create a chart of, well, Zapier's here and Mendix is here and Power Platform's there. So how do you see that landscape, and where do you see Mendix fitting in it?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's evolved, right? As the market has evolved. I mean, you're quite right. Low code describes a whole group of products that just didn't exist. Some of them less than 3 or 4 years ago. There's low code for AI, low code for workflow. There's low code for legal services, low code for financial. So it's a broad spectrum and category of products. But I think if you look at where Mendix sits, and I'll try and address the sort of sit and developer and low code. One thing I do want to take on is there's this misconception between the people that categorize themselves as no-code platforms and then always categorize low-code as, well, that means you have to write code. Well, let's just get this straight. That's not true. Low code doesn't mean you have to write it. It just means that you can. So I want to sort of get that out there right up front. So where does Mendix fit? Well, we fit into, I guess, a sub-segment of low code, which you would call low code application platforms. I mean, it's typically called LCAP, right? Which you hear through, many of the analysts would talk about a subcategorization of low code as LCAP, low code application platforms. So we firmly sit in that bucket. But even inside that bucket, you would think that most of those products are trying to solve the same problem. But the reality is that they're not. And if you take the sort of top 20 products in that bucket, which, you can go and find out what most people think they are, and Mendix is one of those, you can categorize even that group into what we've just said. So some of them are no-code platforms. So they're really about personal productivity, work group, small departmental systems, Kintones, those kinds of products. You then get low code for what we call SaaS or ecosystem extensions. So you then have the BPM players, and I know we had Appian on the show just the other day, which was a great session. I listened to it. And they're really looking at, process orchestration and the sort of bigger change management programs that come with deploying software. And then you're left with a very small group of products that I would term horizontal enterprise low-code platforms that address the entire software development lifecycle, full stack development environments that are designed to take on the complexity of building today's, connected, API-driven, microservices-driven solutions. And that's where Mendix firmly and squarely sits. We sit inside your platform engineering model if you want to integrate, or we can provide you with a complete end-to-end solution. And our customers are building large portfolios of complex applications. And that's typically the way I try and sort of characterize the way Mendix fits into this very crowded and very difficult market for a lot of CIOs to rationalize. It's just very complex. Hopefully that's helpful.
Nick, can you give us a couple of examples, maybe to illustrate really well Mendix's position? Yeah,
I mean, it's interesting. I tried to come up with a couple of new ones. There's one that I always use, and I'll start with that. I mean, the PostNL, which is the Netherlands postal system, it's one that gets used a lot with Mendix. There's a reason for that. It's an order management system that manages the entire parcel delivery for the Netherlands. So, it's a mission critical application. If it stops working, parcels start to stack up. People get angry. There's millions of parcels that go through that system every day. It's a fairly sophisticated microservice architecture of Mendix applications. It employs Amazon SageMaker and Mendix, machine learning kit to do predictive modeling around distribution of parcels around the Netherlands. So it's a very mission critical system that fits nicely into their core systems of records. So that's one example of sort of, I guess, the sort of really high end of where Mendix is used. Organizations like Vivix, it's a glass manufacturer in Brazil. They in 12 months have built sort of 17 applications to take them from what has been a sort of historically monolithic application into building solutions that cover product traceability, production management, statistical process control, operational shift patterns, and they're now embarking on their next journey around how do they embed AI into some of their models. You may have noticed that Roland Bush, the CEO of Siemens, was on stage at CES talking about our relationship with Amazon and Bedrock, embedding that into the platform. So there's a couple of examples. Maybe one last one, the Schwartz Group. I think they're one of the biggest retail groups in the world, about 500,000 people. I don't know if you have Lidl in the
Yep.
US or in the Netherlands, but
Yeah.
that's one of their companies. They built a center of excellence that services sort of 26 development teams, 120 applications. So we're building large portfolios of applications over relatively short periods of time. So there's a sort of cross section of the types of companies that are working with Mendix.
So since Siemens, as you point out, owns Mendix, and uses it within its own products, I wonder, because of that relationship, has Mendix developed sort of a special talents or special abilities in Siemens sort of home markets?
Yeah, I mean, for Siemens, buying Mendix was a good thing for Mendix. I mean, we look back over the last sort of 6 years, and what it's enabled us to do is to prevail to a certain extent. I mean, we're going through some tough times. Siemens is a business that understands sustainability. They're a 175-year-old company, so they know how to operate. They're highly diversified as a business. And have been a great investor in our business, helping us to grow and really take on some of the bigger challenges of enterprise software development, where credibility of a supplier becomes very important. And when you look at most of the low-code providers, many are venture capital funded, or there's smaller organizations, with the exception of obviously with Microsoft, who's sort of cornered the market in citizen development. So it's been very good for us. And what is interesting is they have operations in every corner of the globe. So we go from overnight to having presence in a handful of countries to the ability to operate at scale across the world. But what it has enabled us to do is to work very closely in the industrial manufacturing space, which is their core business. They have a product called Accelerator, which is a digital platform, combines their sort of portfolio of engineering and industrial software for PLM and IoT and ops management, shop floor management. And Mendix is now embedded inside the Accelerator capability. So we've now opened up the low-code option for industrial companies to build software. So that IT/OT world, where these organizations again have not been talking to each other, we can now help with bringing IT and OT together, sitting on top of PLM and SAP and multiple different systems to really help the OT world start to build the systems that they need.
I think it was, as a competing vendor at the time, we're like, oh yes, they've been taken off the market, right? And but an interesting dimension to that was that the way you've just described it is kind of how we felt things would play out. Is that background that Siemens brings would give a vertical focus of sorts, not necessarily to say Mendix has gone vertical, right? But sort of seems, it's interesting to hear from the inside now that was the path. So, John, I got a couple of questions for you coming out of that discussion as the analyst that sees all the companies and everything they're doing. So, Nick brought up a couple of interesting things. One was sort of mentioned a kind of a number of apps. Hey, they built 7 apps or what have you. And so there's one part of this question, John, that pops up into my mind, and they are related because we then talk about a very large customer, is, on that spectrum of low code to no code to wherever, it seems to me that there's always been this idea of how many people do you reach, how many apps do you build, somewhat places you in terms of kind of what you're used for and where your sweet spot is, right? And to give an example, because obviously the personal bias here, but I would quite often go, 7 apps, that's novel. Like these guys over here built 7,000 with Nintex. And then we get into debate about what's an app and things like that. But so one part of the question, John, is that like scale a sort of a way to place where a vendor might fit into an organization? And then if you step up to Lido, however we pronounce it, massive, organization across Europe, and most folks in the US probably don't know about, but it's a global behemoth, right? I know they use many different tools because I've worked with many companies who have low-code tools where they would claim that's a marquee customer, right? So Mendix would say, yeah, Nintex would say they're one of ours. And so, John, how often at that scale of company would you see multiple platforms? How often would you see sort of how are they deciding what goes where? Is it about scale? Is it about sort of user personas? And be great to just get that perspective.
Yeah, certainly to this day there are, in large organizations, there are usually many tools that could be labeled low code. I think to Nick's point earlier, some of them are really serving teams. You know, some of them are servicing departments. I mean, Salesforce has a very, very strong position in and amongst sales and marketing departments. And so you oftentimes would see Salesforce as a, you know, as a, you know, they be deployed, but their scope within the organization was limited. When I towards the end of my time at Forrester, um, we were I would Rob and I actually were beginning to document customers who were using Mendix, some of them out systems, another big competitor of Mendix, to take on the kinds of use cases that Nick described at PostNL. I mean, that is a widely distributed application coordinating among central facilities, just facilities out in the field. These are they're very substantial apps. If you say, well, we've got 7, well, if there's 7 apps like PostNL,
Like that. Yeah, but would never have been built otherwise, right?
To run its operations. I mean, these things are these applications. We were beginning to see Mendix and others step up and actually service these applications. They are high scale. They are mission critical. They have high reliability requirements. Security was a big requirement, and that Rob and I were beginning to document those and those cases. And I think, Nick, it's fair to say you guys have never looked back. I mean, there's a huge amount of value there, and there's an appetite for it, just because so many companies are being dragged down or dragged backwards by 30-year-old mainframe apps or AS400 or and it just it's become a hindrance to operational efficiency and in a digital world.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. The scale and scope of the apps. I think that you have to be sensible also about the way that the market has evolved. I mean, if you look at the sort of the departmental personal productivity end of the market, that's commoditized now. I mean, that's actually, and if you look at the technology adoption curve from Geoffrey Moore crossing the chasm, that's in the laggard stage at the moment, and it's cornered by one significant manufacturer that will continue to own that market. Most of the organizations we're in have a multi-platform strategy, and they would actually use Mendix, as John has said, when they look at their portfolio of applications. And I think one thing that's important that we want to advocate is that our platform pushes to the extremes of software development. So we have a portfolio intake mechanism where you can gather an ideation, you can value assess it, you can decide which technologies are good for using Mendix and which aren't. And we're quite happy to have applications inside the Mendix platform and portfolio that may well be built using another technology. That's just part of a healthy ecosystem of technologies working together. So very important that we look at what we're good at, and that means that we're not often deploying thousands of applications, but those applications are very strategic and as John says, often mission critical in nature.
I think it's a worthwhile exercise. I think for every vendor, I always try to paint this picture for my customer because you quite often get the executive or VP level type person who would come up and say, we're looking to standardize, right? And you're talking about these companies with hundreds of thousands of employees. You're like, sure, okay, like here's the landscape, and you might standardize to our discussion. You might standardize on Mendix for this, and you might standardize on QuickBase for that, and you might use Airtable for these things over here. And I get there's some complexity to that, and there'll be some overlap and what have you. But trying to help people understand how to think about that holistically and think about the skill sets and picking the right technology for the right problem space, I think so has been critical. So on that, so Nick, a question for you. You brought up the sort of citizen developer concept.
Yeah.
and that's the term that everybody sort of aspires to. Like, who is this mythical person, right? So how does Mendix think about citizen developers? So how would you describe one? How would you, if you had to write the job description, we're hiring a senior citizen developer, and here's what they look like: skills, background, attributes, that type of thing. And what do you think is an industry we could or should be doing to help develop more of these people, or help these people come out from wherever they're hiding, and sort of grasp this title and with pride and forge a path forward?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question, and I'll give you our opinion on it, and my opinion on citizen development. I think the interesting thing about citizen development or citizen developers is the way that I categorize them is that they see the world through the problems that they and their immediate counterparts are struggling with. So they're about fixing business problems in the moment often, and they're about using whatever technology they can bring to hand to do that. So their scope is very narrow. It's about, I have a team or an individual or a small group of people. We have this particular business problem to solve. Can I use this technology to solve that problem? That's how I would categorize a typical citizen developer. And, to your point about how would I recruit one? Well, I don't think you would, because most citizen developers have a day job, right? Yep. They're not out there on the market, recruiting for citizen development. They're actually, and this is the quandary with citizen developers, they are generally trying to use technology to make their work more efficient, or to do more, or the team more. So they don't see themselves as citizen developers as such. I mean, they get given that label, but they really have focus on that. If you then look at business technologists, which I think is a natural evolution from a citizen developer, business technologists are the same. They sit inside the business, they understand technology, but their remit is to build technology to solve problems in multiple different teams or departments. So they see the world in a different way. They're looking at scale, they're looking at reuse, they're looking at how do they create technology that can be componentized. So what we found, we started off with citizen developers, and still citizen developers sit inside our platform. We're a very broad spectrum of users, from citizen developers to high code, engineers who sit inside, a cross-functional team. Back to my point earlier, those people come together to collaborate to build these sort of strategic and complex solutions. So what we tend to find is citizen developers inside the Mendix world, and I'm not saying that it's the same for everybody, are typically more subject matter experts who come into a cross-functional team. They probably use the tool for testing, maybe some very basic changes. They're part of the participants in collaboration. They're in the sprints. And they're managing the platform, the intake, and so on. So they're not traditionally what you would see as a citizen developer, perhaps using a no-code platform or a Microsoft platform. And what happens is you tend to find that citizen developers over time migrate to become business technologists. They get the bug. So we typically, if I was going to go recruit somebody, I would be designing a specification for a business technologist, somebody who understands how to use macros in Excel spreadsheet, understands how to use perhaps some of the automation tools that are out there, thinks about technology and not about individual business problems. So I'd categorize it like that. And I think the biggest challenge with citizen developers is why it's a bit like the law of diminishing returns. You change one parameter and you drop in a citizen developer and get them to build all this software, but you don't change any of the other parameters. Eventually, time, you start to run out of room. Lack of control, lack of governance, portfolio management, value assessment. So what we try and do is create a place for everyone, and typically we're looking for the sort of that bridge between citizen developer and business technologist, who really start to come into their own when you surround them with the right environment, the right technology, the right organizational cultural structure. They become very, very, very potent contributors to complex problem solving. So I'm not sure whether that's the direction we're looking for, but that's definitely how we see the two.
It's a really good answer, because it sort of speaks to that idea of, I think what I've seen as well is that over time you tend to find, if the citizen developer does it enough and gets the right level of either overtly or otherwise reward, recognition, sense of satisfaction, they start looking for more things to solve. And so to your point, if you were to say, hey, actually, we have this role called business technologist, and we're now going to pluck you out of the business
Yeah.
and put you in this. Now, granted, you're going to lose over time then some of your subject matter expertise. There's a trade-off to be made there, right? But I
Yes.
think that's a really good perspective on it, because it speaks to I think one of the big needs, which is that we have to find ways to reward, to recognize the people doing
Yes.
this work, right? To
Yeah.
celebrate that work, and to not have in the past of shadow IT, you're building these skunk work solutions. Like, no, someone's trying to get things fixed, move the business forward, help us to achieve our objectives.
Yeah.
How
No,
can we harness that?
if you take a citizen developer out of their role and make them business, oh, there's a hole in the business, right? Because they were
Right.
doing the job, right? So they had a day job. So all of a sudden, I think this sort of person that you want to become two things. You want to become a developer that drives forward technology and also run a day job. It just over time just becomes unmanageable because people just cannot do those two things effectively. So we have to think about how we make space for those people to evolve. Sorry, John.
No, I'm sorry. I'm just curious, how often do you see customers formalizing these roles, and actually, as Ryan was saying, sort of provide a career path from someone who's a business expert and has a facility for
Yeah.
technology to someone who's going to start to look across
Yeah.
multiple. I mean, how often do you see folks formalizing that?
In recent years, more often, yes, more often. I mean, previously, probably a couple of years ago, not so much, right? It was very much let's give them some technology and let's allow them to use that technology in a specific confined space. So we are starting to see the formalization of the roles, but not just the roles, but the actual structure of a cross-functional team. Because back to the team sport analogy earlier, that I think most organizations are waking up to the fact that actually a low-code platform is only a small part of the solution to the problem. Organizational structure, methodology, how do you actually bring the participants together around this technology to make something work? So we started to see that becoming much more formalized. Typically, citizen developers, will be using a set of technologies. When we look at our teams, there's very much a progression from citizen developer to business technologist to, maybe product owner, product manager involved in that. And then you have every other discipline from UX, UI, test automation, operations, deployment, and also somebody financially managing that. So I think there's a level of maturity that's starting to come as organizations look to platforms like Mendix to solve more complex software development challenges. It sort of comes with the territory. If you're wanting to sort of build systems that cross multiple disparate data sources, multiple processors, you inevitably have to bring a group of people together. And once you do that, then you've got to create the rules of the game engagement. So the game being a game, it has to have a set of rules and everybody knows how to play that. So Mendix is very much seeing that formalized. We've actually spent an awful lot of time over the last number of years in building our digital execution practice, which is part of, I guess, a whole product offering again. If you look back to the way that the products evolve, where technology is obviously a fundamental part of what we deliver. But actually, when you want to build portfolios of applications, you need to surround it with a whole product. So you need methodologies, you need to intake of applications, onboard, offboard applications, governance and control frameworks. So a bit of an expansive answer there, John, but I think it is very much becoming I wouldn't say a playbook, but the roles are very much well defined and progression across those roles.
I couldn't agree with you more, Nick. That my own conclusion is that organizational change is that the most important barriers to achieving the full benefit of low code are in organizational change, not in the technology.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Fully agree.
Speaking of technology, Mendix has been incorporating AI into its product and integrating with AI. You mentioned the AI services you use that are provided by Amazon as a key partner. There's a lot of confusion about AI just in general, I think, and then we, particularly relative to low code, we've actually heard people tell us that AI enabled code generation is going to eliminate the need for low code. we don't, we just think that's crazy. But anyway, maybe I'd love to get your sense of how AI will affect low code, how it will improve low code offerings, and maybe even help to tackle some of these organizational challenges we've been discussing.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, I did a definitive answer because I actually asked ChatGPT whether it was going to replace low code, and it told me no. So I can tell you.
Go to the source. Love it.
But no, interesting. I did ask it, and it came up with what I thought was a very sensible answer. And I think the reality of life is that no, not anytime soon. Look, part of the problem we're trying to solve here is that code isn't the common language through which we want people to communicate when it comes to building software. Visual models are much better at doing that, right? They just drop down the barriers, make sure that anybody can participate. If I can walk you through a Mendix microflow, and I can fully annotate it and document it, and it's a thing to behold. You can lay out a full process. You can get multiple people, whether they're technical or non-technical, to walk through that. It just breaks down those barriers when it comes to collaboration. So code for me isn't what we should be doing. I mean, we don't generate. Mendix is not a code generator, right? We don't output code. I mean, that's the thing of the past. I think it's something that we don't need to do anymore. So I don't think that the automatic generation of code, however good that code might be, will ever become something that would be adopted without someone having to look under the bonnet and see what was developed and understand the quality of the code and how to maintain it. I mean, it's a big risk to take on something that's been automatically generated, however good it might be, and then deploy it in a mission critical environment and run your business off the back of it. I just don't see that happening. So for me, I think more sensibly what will happen is what we're doing right now with Mendix, which is where we're augmenting, large language model capabilities into the development software. So you look at AI for application development, where we have a series of trained bots inside the Mendix environment, which help you as a sort of pair programmer. They're sitting over the shoulder telling you, do you really want to do that? This might be a better way of doing it. Oh, by the way, we looked through your model, a minute ago, and it's not very performant what you did over there. Maybe if you go back, I can tell you how you might be a little bit more performant if you did it differently. And often what we're doing now is nudging people towards making their own better decisions rather than doing it for them. But I think in time what will happen is obviously those technologies will be able to look at the sort of vast array of data we have on our models and be able to auto-generate a lot of that. But it will be visual. So you'll be able to see it, you'll be able to engage with it, and you'll be able to adapt and model with it. So I think that's the way we certainly see the world going. And you then look at the softer side of using large language models. I talked earlier about portfolio. I actually happen to think that the most important thing going forward, particularly in a multi-platform strategy, is the technology that owns the intake, that understands all the ideas that are coming from the business, collates those ideas, assesses them, provides the governance framework and the value realization, so you can make an educated decision on where you might combine multiple apps together because it's just more cost effective. You might build a service rather than build an app. I think that's the important part. Now, if you look at that intake, large language models play a great role in there, helping people to write, user requirements, helping them to define application functionality, automatically taking that and building value propositions from it, and then distilling that into user stories, and then epics, and then epics into user stories, and user stories into tasks, and so on. So I think we'll see large language models proliferate all the way through the application development lifecycle. And let's not forget where most of the organizations are playing today is embedding AI inside their applications. So, intelligent smart apps where large language models are embedded with machine learning kits like the one we have at Mendix. So yes, I think it's a very exciting time, and for sure we'll see some significant changes, but I don't think they'll be replacing local platforms anytime soon.
So it's a great answer, Nick, and it's interesting. We as always with these things, you could go long. I've got ideas in my head now where we could run for another 40 minutes talking about this. So it'll have to be for another day. We're like, oh yeah, right. But that's a wrap on episode 8. Nick, I really want to thank you for your time. It's been extremely insightful. I feel like we could carry on once we hit the stop button on this and dig in much deeper on some of these topics. John, Thanks for joining today, and thanks for everyone for tuning in, and look forward to seeing you in the next great episode. Have a great day.
Thanks for inviting me. It's great.